For countless young men and women, enlisting in the military is not merely a career decision, but a defining leap into a life shaped by duty, discipline, and uncertainty, a choice often made in an age when the future still feels abstract and invincible. And for families watching from the sidelines, parents, siblings, loved ones, it becomes a silent contract signed not just by the recruit, but by everyone who cares for them. Because an 8-year military commitment carries weight far beyond paperwork, demanding sacrifice, resilience, and faith in an institution that promises honor yet cannot guarantee safety. History has shown that while combat is the most visible danger, it is far from the only one, as more than half of military deaths occur not on battlefields, but through accidents, illnesses, and unseen hazards tied to the work itself. Risks rarely discussed in recruitment offices or patriotic speeches, and yet despite this, many veterans later say the cost was worth it, unless the system fails them, because when a service member is harmed, the least a family expects in return for that sacrifice is honesty, something the Whipkey family would never receive. Lieutenant Paul Whipkey was everything the Army claimed to value: a bright, disciplined young pilot with a promising future, a man who maintained close contact with his family even as military life pulled him farther from home. And yet one day, without warning or explanation, the Army would claim that this same man, stable, dedicated, and deeply bonded to his loved ones, had inexplicably abandoned his post, ripped all his teeth from his mouth, driven deep into the desert, parked his car miles from civilization, and wandered off to die. A narrative so implausible that it left behind more questions than answers, beginning with why the U.S. Army was so quick to label him a deserter and so reluctant to search for him. Why strange men in black suits had been seen watching and intimidating him before his disappearance, and whether his dangerous proximity to one of America's most secretive military zones had sealed his fate. Paul Whipkey was born on April 25, 1932, in rural Pennsylvania, a time and place where military service was seen as both duty and honor. And from a young age, he showed determination and technical aptitude, qualities that led him to enroll in the Reserve Officers Training Corps at Pennsylvania State University, where he earned not only his commission in 1954, but also a degree in civil engineering, marking him as both a thinker and a leader. And from there, his ambitions carried him skyward as he trained to become an Army aviator, earning his wings by 1956 and quickly gaining recognition for his skill flying small propeller-driven aircraft on observation missions, flights that demanded precision, courage, and trust in the systems guiding him. By the time First Lieutenant Whipkey received his first major duty assignment, the world was locked in the grip of cold war paranoia, with the United States and the Soviet Union standing on the edge of a nuclear standoff, and his orders sent him not to a bustling base or overseas front, but to a lonely outpost in the Nevada desert known as Camp Desert Rock, a name that revealed little about its true purpose, because by 1957, as fears of nuclear war intensified, this isolated base became one of the epicenters of America's atomic testing program, a place where weapons far more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were detonated in the open air, and where soldiers were told they were safely observing history, when in reality, many were unknowingly becoming part of an experiment. Camp Desert Rock served as both testing ground and classroom, where troops were positioned to witness nuclear explosions firsthand in order to prepare for a hypothetical radioactive battlefield. And as part of Operation Plum Bob, a massive series of atmospheric and underground nuclear tests conducted between May and October of 1957, Lieutenant Whipkey participated in at least 5 detonations, not from the ground but from the air, piloting his aircraft close enough to capture invaluable data on blast effects, radiation spread, and environmental impact, a role praised by superiors and researchers alike. Yet beneath the official language of safety briefings and controlled exposure lay a darker truth, one that Whipkey and many others were never fully told: that safe distance was often a calculated lie, and that some tests were designed not only to study weapons, but to study what those weapons did to human bodies, a truth that would soon begin to carve itself into Paul Whipkey's flesh, his health, and ultimately his fate. Flying through the skies above nuclear test zones was described to Lieutenant Paul Whipke as a controlled, calculated duty, one wrapped in assurances of safety and necessity. Yet with each mission carried out under Operation Plumbob, the invisible danger surrounding him grew thicker, more insidious, because while soldiers on the ground were told to turn away or shield their eyes, Army aviators like Whipke were sent directly into contaminated airspace to observe blast behavior, shockwaves, and radioactive dispersal from above, trusting instruments and orders that would later prove deeply flawed. Radiation, unlike bullets or explosions, leaves no immediate warning, no sound, no smell, and no instant pain. But it does not forgive ignorance, and within weeks of completing several observation flights, Paul Whipke's body began to betray him in ways no training manual had prepared him for, as small black moles appeared across his skin, spreading rapidly and unpredictably, followed by angry red rashes that resembled severe burns despite no exposure to fire. And then came the blisters, raw, painful lesions forming on his hands as if his own flesh were rejecting itself. Initially, Army medical staff dismissed these symptoms as stress-related reactions or environmental irritation common to desert assignments. But Whipke knew something was wrong deep within his body because the pain did not fade with rest and instead worsened, burrowing inward, manifesting as violent stomach cramps so intense that they robbed him of his appetite and left him physically weakened. A shocking transformation for a man once considered to be in peak condition. As his health spiraled, Whipke found himself confined more frequently to the base infirmary, where doctors attempted to treat symptoms they either could not fully diagnose or were not authorized to openly acknowledge. And it was there that the most horrifying sign of radiation sickness emerged, as one by one, his teeth began to loosen and fall out, not due to decay or injury, but because the radiation had damaged the tissue and bone supporting them, a grotesque and undeniable indicator of severe exposure. Faced with no viable treatment and a rapidly deteriorating patient, Army medical personnel made the drastic decision to remove what remained of Whipke's teeth, replacing them with fitted dentures, a procedure that marked a grim milestone. Because in the span of just a few months, Paul Whipke had gone from a healthy, ambitious young officer to a man physically broken by the very missions he had been praised for completing. Yet the damage was not limited to his body, as radiation sickness is notorious for affecting the mind as well, and those who knew Whipke best began to notice subtle but alarming changes in his behavior. As the once calm, composed pilot became increasingly withdrawn, his conversation shorter, his demeanor tense, his eyes frequently darting as if scanning for threats only he could perceive. Transferred to Fort Ord, California, in October of 1957, Whipke was meant to recover away from the nuclear testing environment, but instead, his condition continued to worsen, and so did his mental state, as friends, fellow officers, and even superiors observed a growing sense of paranoia, a constant vigilance that bordered on fear, as if he believed he was being watched, followed, or evaluated. Despite these changes, his professionalism never fully disappeared, and he remained a dedicated soldier who carried out his duties without complaint, earning continued respect from those under his command. But something fundamental had shifted within him, something shaped not only by physical suffering, but by knowledge he may have gained during his time at Camp Desert Rock. Knowledge that made him cautious, guarded, and deeply uneasy. Whispers circulated among personnel that Whipke had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, but no official acknowledgement was ever made. And the subject was quietly avoided, perhaps because admitting fault would mean admitting that American soldiers had been deliberately placed in harm's way without informed consent, a scandal too explosive for the Cold War era. Instead, those around Whipke rationalized his erratic behavior as a tragic but understandable consequence of illness, choosing not to ask questions that might invite uncomfortable answers. And so, when he mentioned on July 10th, 1958, that he was heading into town for a drink, it was met not with suspicion but relief, as if a few hours away from base might finally give him some peace, a brief escape from pain, pressure, and whatever silent burdens he carried, and no one, least of all Paul Whipkey himself, could have known that this simple departure would mark the final moment he was ever seen alive, setting into motion a disappearance so riddled with contradictions that it would haunt his family for decades to come. In the months following his transfer to Fort Ord, Lieutenant Paul Whipkey's distance from his family grew more pronounced, not because affection had faded, but because fear and secrecy seemed to have taken hold of him, transforming a once open and communicative man into someone cautious with every word, every silence heavy with meaning. And nowhere was this more evident than in his final conversation with his brother Carl. A call that would later replay endlessly in Carl's mind as both a warning and a farewell. Paul's voice that day was hushed, urgent, and strangely energized, a sharp contrast to the fatigue and illness that had plagued him for months. And as he spoke, he rambled excitedly about an upcoming assignment, one he claimed would make a name for him, a phrase that struck Carl as deeply unsettling given Paul's deteriorating health and recent struggles. Because this was not how a man spoke when preparing for rest or recovery, but how someone spoke when standing on the edge of something monumental, something dangerous. When Carl pressed for details, Paul abruptly fell silent, lowering his voice even further and explaining that there were officers nearby and that he could not say more, a justification that raised immediate alarm, because Paul had never before hidden routine assignments from his family, and yet now he sounded as though merely speaking openly could place him at risk. After that call, every attempt Carl made to reach his brother was met with silence, weeks stretching into months with no return messages, no letters, no reassurance, a disappearance that felt gradual at first, then suddenly absolute. On July 12, 1958, 2 days after Paul was last seen, Carl finally contacted Fort Ord directly, hoping to locate his brother through official channels, only to be met with a response that stunned him to the core, as the operator casually informed him that First Lieutenant Whipkey had been listed as AWOL, absent without official leave. The previous day, a designation that made no sense to Carl, because despite Paul's declining health and strange behavior, he was still a disciplined officer, a man who believed deeply in duty and responsibility, not someone who would simply abandon his post without explanation. As Carl pressed for information, he noticed how evasive the responses became, questions deflected, details withheld, the tone shifting from polite to guarded. And what troubled him even more was learning that men were already packing up Paul's personal belongings to be shipped to his next of kin, a move that violated military protocol, because such actions were only permitted if a service member was confirmed deceased or officially declared deserter, neither of which applied to Paul at that time. To Carl, this premature clearing of his brother's quarters felt like a quiet admission that the Army already believed Paul would never return, a belief formed far too quickly for a man missing barely 24 hours. When Paul's belongings finally arrived, Carl discovered an overlooked document buried among the paperwork, a report detailing Paul's participation in Operation Plum Bob and the hazardous observational flights he had flown during nuclear testing. And as Carl studied the document, connecting it with Paul's sudden illness and erratic behavior, a chilling realization began to take shape, that his brother had not simply been exposed to radiation, but may have learned something during those missions that placed him in danger long after the explosions faded. Meanwhile, back at Fort Ord, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lewis, Paul's commanding officer, was equally disturbed by the way the situation was being handled, because in all his time serving alongside Whipkey, both at Camp Desert Rock and later in California, Paul had never given cause for disciplinary concern, and Lewis could not reconcile the image of a loyal, suffering officer with the Army's swift move to treat him as a liability rather than a missing man. As weeks passed with no organized search, no interviews of friends or family, and no meaningful investigative effort, Lewis began to reflect on events he had once dismissed as inconsequential, remembering the presence of strange civilians wandering restricted areas of Camp Desert Rock, men dressed in dark suits who did not wear uniforms, did not carry visible credentials, and yet seemed to move freely through security checkpoints, engaging and hushed. conversations with Paul both before and after missions. Lewis recalled how visibly shaken Paul appeared after these encounters, how his already fragile composure deteriorated further each time, and how the arrival of these men coincided eerily with the worsening of his health, prompting an unsettling question Lewis could no longer ignore. Were these men there to help Paul, to recruit him, or to ensure his silence? When Lewis attempted to raise concerns or seek clarification, he was met not with cooperation but resistance, eventually being urged to abandon the matter entirely, a request that only reinforced the sense that something about Paul Whipkey's disappearance was being deliberately concealed, and as the Army quietly shifted its focus away from finding him, those who cared about the missing pilot were left staring into a widening void, one filled with unanswered questions, suppressed truths, and the haunting certainty that Paul's final phone call had not been a promise of success, but a signal that he knew his time was running out. In early August of 1958, less than a month after Lieutenant Paul Whipkey vanished without a trace, the United States Army made a decision that would forever redefine his story, officially changing his status from AWOL to that of a deserter, a label that carried not only legal consequences, but a devastating moral judgment, because desertion implied cowardice, betrayal, and deliberate abandonment of duty, traits that stood in direct opposition to everything those who knew Whipkey believed him to. And when word of this decision reached Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lewis, his commanding officer, he was left incredulous, unable to reconcile the Army's conclusion with the man he had served beside, a man who had endured radiation sickness, physical collapse, and mental strain without once shirking responsibility. Lewis expected that the declaration of desertion would ignite an urgent response. Search teams dispatched, investigators assigned, interviews conducted, but instead, he was met with apathy, as if the Army had already closed the book on Whipkey's fate, and the absence of concern was as disturbing as the label itself. Lewis noticed that while official paperwork moved swiftly, practical efforts to locate the missing officer were conspicuously absent. No door-to-door inquiries, no outreach to family members, no coordinated searches of nearby towns or desert routes. And when Lewis began asking uncomfortable questions, seeking clarification about what steps were being taken, he found himself stonewalled at every turn, answers vague, explanations inconsistent, and eventually, subtle pressure applied to discourage further inquiry, as though pursuing the truth was itself an act of insubordination. As Lewis reflected on his time at Camp Desert Rock, memories once dismissed as routine now took on an ominous weight, particularly his recollection of civilians roaming the base, men dressed in dark, conservative suits who did not wear insignia and did not appear on any duty, rosters, yet somehow bypassed security protocols that applied even to senior officers, and Lewis distinctly remembered seeing these men speaking with Whipkey in private, their conversations brief but intense, always leaving Paul visibly shaken, his posture stiff, his eyes hollow with unease, and it struck Lewis as no coincidence that these encounters occurred around the same time Whipkey's health began a sharp decline. When Lewis attempted to document these observations or raise them through official channels, he was warned, politely at first, then more firmly, that continuing to pursue the matter would be detrimental to his own career, a warning that confirmed his growing suspicion that whatever had happened to Paul Whipkey extended far beyond a simple case of a troubled officer wandering off into the desert. Meanwhile, the Whipkey family struggled under the weight of the deserter designation, as it not only tarnished Paul's record, but cast doubt on his character, leaving them isolated and powerless. And for Carl Whipkey in particular, the decision felt like a calculated effort to erase his brother's humanity, because by branding Paul a deserter, the Army absolved itself of responsibility, conveniently closing the door on further investigation. The narrative presented was simple and cold, that Whipkey had suffered a mental breakdown brought on by stress and illness, abandoned his duties, and disappeared of his own accord. A story that required no deeper scrutiny and no uncomfortable admissions about radiation exposure, covert operations, or classified testing programs. Yet this explanation unraveled quickly when Paul's car was discovered not by military personnel, but by a California fish and game warden, more than 500 miles from Fort Ord, deep within the unforgiving expanse of Death Valley, parked miles from the nearest road or settlement. A location so remote that reaching it deliberately would require careful planning rather than confused wandering. And when authorities examined the vehicle, they found no signs of crash, no evidence of struggle, and no indication of foul play. Only the eerie stillness of abandonment, with the keys left in the ignition, a pair of dog tags bearing Whipkey's name resting inside, and a small briefcase containing personal effects, items that seemed deliberately arranged rather than hastily discarded. Despite these unsettling details, the Army moved quickly to conclude that Whipkey had driven himself into the desert, exited the vehicle, and wandered off to die of exposure. A conclusion reached with remarkable confidence given the complete absence of a body, footprints, or forensic evidence. And even more troubling was the fact that no immediate effort was made to recover his remains. Because in military culture, even deserters are typically recovered, identified, and accounted for. Yet in this case, no formal search was launched until 9 months later, long after desert conditions would have erased any trace of a human body. To Carl, this delay was not negligence, but intent, as if the passage of time itself was being used as a weapon to ensure that nothing could ever be proven. And as he studied the timeline, the decisions, and the contradictions, one conclusion became impossible to ignore: that the Army had not lost Paul Whipkey, it had abandoned him, and in doing so, had buried the truth alongside whatever fate awaited him in the desert. As the Army quietly closed its investigation and moved on, Carl Whipkey did the opposite, refusing to accept a conclusion that felt less like truth and more like convenience. And over the following years, he began methodically retracing his brother's final known movements, treating the mystery not as a grieving sibling, but as a determined investigator. Because the more Carl examined the details surrounding Paul's abandoned car in Death Valley, the clearer it became that the official narrative was riddled with contradictions. Records revealed that on July 10, 1958, the last confirmed day Paul was seen, he had left Fort Ord and driven hundreds of miles to White's Motel in Mojave, California, a stop that appeared deliberate rather than impulsive, and according to the motel's guest registry, Paul signed in that night and checked out the following morning. An action that contradicted the Army's claim that he was mentally unstable and wandering aimlessly, because men in the grip of breakdowns do not typically follow structured travel patterns or maintain receipts. Further evidence surfaced in the form of a gas station receipt found inside Paul's vehicle, documenting the purchase of 14 gallons of gasoline in Mojave, more than enough fuel to reach Death Valley. Yet to Carl, this only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it, because while the receipt confirmed that the car had been refueled, it did not prove that Paul was the one driving it afterward. In this distinction became crucial as Carl interviewed witnesses who had been overlooked or ignored during the Army's cursory investigation. Wildlife wardens who first discovered the abandoned car described the area surrounding it as littered with burnt cigarette butts, a seemingly minor detail until Carl realized its significance. Because Paul Whipkey had never smoked a day in his life, a habit confirmed by family, friends, and military colleagues alike, making the presence of multiple cigarette remains near the vehicle not only suspicious, but incompatible with the Army's version of events. Even more troubling was the testimony of a local ranger who reported seeing a vehicle matching Paul's Chevrolet around the time of his disappearance, noting that the man behind the wheel was wearing a formal military uniform, a detail that directly conflicted with accounts from Fort Ord personnel, all of whom confirmed that Paul had left the base wearing civilian clothes. And when Carl compared these inconsistencies, a disturbing alternative scenario began to take shape: that Paul had driven to Mojave for a prearranged meeting, and that somewhere beyond that point, his car had been taken from him, either voluntarily or by force. Carl theorized that Mojave may have served as a rendezvous point, a controlled environment far from Fort Ord, but close enough to military infrastructure to facilitate covert movement, and that whoever Paul had been in contact with, possibly the same unidentified men seen around Camp Desert Rock, had assumed control of the vehicle, driving it deep into Death Valley to stage a disappearance, a location chosen precisely because of its vastness, hostility, and ability to erase evidence. This theory gained further weight when Carl examined the items left inside the car, noting how neatly they were arranged, the keys left in the ignition, the dog tags placed where they would be easily found. Details that felt less like the aftermath of a breakdown and more like the careful construction of a narrative designed to guide investigators toward a predetermined conclusion. Carl's suspicions were further reinforced when he learned of another case eerily similar to his brother's, that of First Lieutenant Charles Guess, an Army aviator who had served alongside Paul at Camp Desert Rock and had also been involved in nuclear-related operations. And just 12 days after Paul vanished, Guess took off on a reconnaissance flight from Bishop, California, never to return, his aircraft disappearing without a trace, only for wreckage and remains to be discovered more than a year later in a remote mountainous region, accompanied by the unsettling revelation that the serial number on the recovered plane did not match the one Guess had been flying, a discrepancy that raised more questions than answers. To Carl, the pattern was impossible to ignore, as both men were pilots, both exposed to sensitive operations, and both seemingly erased under circumstances that defied standard military logic, suggesting not coincidence but design. Armed with these findings, Carl's quest shifted from seeking closure to exposing a truth he believed had been deliberately buried, a truth that suggested his brother did not walk into the desert to die, but was removed from the equation by forces far more powerful than any single officer, forces capable of manipulating records, silencing witnesses, and rewriting reality itself. By the late 1970s, nearly 2 decades after Lieutenant Paul Whipkey vanished, Carl Whipkey had exhausted every informal avenue available to him, having written letters, conducted interviews, and pieced together a shadow history that contradicted the official record at every turn. And with mounting frustration and resolve, he turned his attention to the one institution he believed could no longer deflect his questions: the Federal Bureau of Investigation, formally submitting a request in 1978 under the Freedom of Information Act for all materials related to his brother's disappearance, a move that should have forced transparency but instead opened the door to one of the most chilling revelations in the entire case. According to Carl, the FBI responded by informing him that all documents connected to Paul Whipkey's file had been destroyed, burned only months earlier, an explanation that defied logic and standard archival procedure, especially given the case's unresolved status and its intersection with national security matters. And the timing alone was enough to raise alarm, because the destruction occurred shortly before Carl's request, as if the agency had anticipated scrutiny and acted preemptively to ensure nothing remained to be examined. To Carl, this was not bureaucratic coincidence, but confirmation that his brother's fate had been entangled with secrets too dangerous to preserve on paper, secrets that someone, somewhere, had deemed worth erasing entirely. As he revisited the events leading up to Paul's disappearance through this new lens, Carl found renewed significance in the strange men seen around Camp Desert Rock. Civilians who bypassed military security and interacted with Paul in hushed, private exchanges, men whose presence suggested intelligence involvement rather than routine oversight. And this realization led Carl to formulate 2 competing yet equally disturbing theories, each rooted in Cold War realities where human lives were often secondary to strategic advantage. The first theory proposed that Paul Whipkey had been recruited by an intelligence agency, possibly the CIA, for a covert mission deemed too sensitive to refuse and too dangerous to survive, because despite his failing health, Paul remained a highly skilled aviator with first-hand knowledge of nuclear testing operations. And if the agency believed his radiation sickness meant he had limited time left, they may have viewed him as an expendable asset, assigning him to a mission from which return was neither expected nor necessary. A scenario that aligned disturbingly well with Paul's final phone call to Carl, in which he spoke of an important assignment that would make a name for him while refusing to provide details. The second theory was far darker, rooted not in recruitment, but in containment, suggesting that Paul was not selected for further service, but instead identified as a liability, a man whose exposure to nuclear testing and worsening health made him unpredictable, and whose knowledge of unethical radiation experiments posed a catastrophic risk if revealed to the public, because during the height of the Cold War, the United States nuclear testing program was one of the most closely guarded operations in history, and any confirmation that soldiers had been deliberately exposed to lethal radiation doses would have triggered public outrage, congressional investigations, and potentially the collapse of critical defense initiatives. Under this theory, the men in dark suits were not there to offer Paul opportunity, but to assess his silence, to intimidate him, and ultimately to decide whether he could be trusted to keep what he knew buried. And when that trust could not be guaranteed, his disappearance became a matter of national security rather than criminal investigation. The destruction of FBI records, the Army's rush to label him a deserter, the lack of a meaningful search, and the carefully staged abandonment of his. Carl fit within this framework, painting a picture of an operation designed not to find Paul Whipkey, but to ensure he was never found. Yet even as Carl confronted these conclusions, he found himself trapped in a system that offered acknowledgement without accountability, whispers without proof, and sympathy without action, because without documents, bodies, or witnesses willing to speak on record, the truth remained just out of reach, sealed behind classified walls and institutional silence, leaving Carl to carry the unbearable weight of knowing that his brother's disappearance was no accident, but likely the result of deliberate choices made by people who would never be named, never questioned, and never held responsible. In 1982, after nearly 25 years of unanswered questions, quiet resistance, and relentless personal investigation, Carl Whipkey finally stood before the Army Board for the correction of military records, carrying with him not only files and testimonies, but the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent chasing a truth that refused to surface. And while he no longer believed the system would fully acknowledge what had happened to his brother, he hoped at the very least to remove the stain of desertion that had haunted Paul's name for decades. During a 3-day hearing, Carl presented evidence that dismantled the Army's original narrative piece by piece, demonstrating that Paul Whipkey's record showed no history of misconduct, no disciplinary issues, and no behavioral patterns consistent with desertion. And although the board stopped short of opening a new investigation or addressing the deeper questions surrounding radiation exposure, intelligence involvement, or staged evidence, they reached one significant conclusion: that there was no proof Paul had ever deserted, and as a result, his official status was quietly amended from deserter to died in the line of duty, a correction that restored honor to his service record but offered no explanation, no accountability, and no closure. The Army did not disclose how, when, or where Paul had died, nor did it revisit the circumstances of his disappearance, effectively closing the case while leaving its most critical questions unanswered. And for Carl and the rest of the Whipkey family, the ruling felt like a hollow victory, because while Paul's reputation had been salvaged, his fate remained buried beneath layers of silence. To this day, no physical trace of Lieutenant Paul Whipkey has ever been recovered, no remains, no verified eyewitness account of his final moments. Only fragments of a story scattered across deserts, declassified reports, and faded memories, and for researchers and conspiracy theorists alike, the case continues to provoke chilling speculation, particularly when viewed alongside the long history of men in black encounters reported since the late 1940s, in which individuals tied to sensitive sightings or classified knowledge claimed to be visited by anonymous figures dressed in dark suits. Figures who delivered thinly veiled threats designed to enforce silence. And while there is no direct evidence linking Paul Whipkey's disappearance to UFO phenomena, there is one final detail that ensures his story will never fully fade into obscurity: the geography of where he served. Just beyond Camp Desert Rock, across the Nevada wilderness, lies one of the most secretive military installations in human history, a place long rumored to house experimental aircraft, recovered technologies, and programs operating far beyond public knowledge. A location the world would later come to know simply as Area 51. And while there is no proof that Paul encountered anything extraterrestrial, the Proximity alone raises haunting possibilities about what he may have witnessed during aerial observation missions conducted near restricted airspace. Possibilities compounded by the fact that during Operation Plum Bob, numerous pilots reported anomalous readings, unexplained equipment failures, and restricted post-mission debriefings. When all these elements are considered together, the radiation sickness, the strange men, the rushed deserter designation, the staged vehicle, the burned FBI files, the second aviator's suspicious death, and the Army's eventual yet incomplete mission, it becomes impossible to dismiss Paul Whipkey's disappearance as the tragic result of a mental breakdown, because the pattern suggests not chaos, but control. Perhaps Paul was recruited for a mission from which return was never intended. Perhaps he was silenced to protect secrets deemed more valuable than a human life. Or perhaps he simply learned too much at the wrong moment in history, a time when fear of nuclear annihilation justified actions that would be unthinkable today. And so his story remains suspended between truth and secrecy, a Cold War ghost whose fate was decided behind closed doors, leaving behind only a name, a record corrected too late, and a question that still echoes across the desert. What really happened to Lieutenant Paul Whipkey, and what did he see that made him disappear forever?